So we just finished going through the prophet Jonah, which is one of my favorites, and we're going to be working with the prophet Haggai today, which is only 2 chapters, and so we're just going to do this piece of text this morning. But if you're following in a Pew Bible, Haggai chapter 1, 15 through 2, verse 9, and you can find it in a Pew Bible on page 579 of the Old Testament. In the 2nd year of King Darius, in the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Haggai, saying, "Speak now to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people, and say, Who is left among you that saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Is it not in your sight as nothing? Yet now take courage, O Zerubbabel, says the Lord. Take courage, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak." There's just so many in a row, I'm sorry. "The high priest, take courage, all of you people of the land, says the Lord. Work, for I am with you, says the Lord of hosts. According to the promise that I made you when you came out of Egypt, my spirit abides among you. Do not fear, for thus says the Lord of hosts, once again, in a little while I will shake the heavens and the earth, and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all the nations, so that the treasure of all nations shall come. And I will fill this house with splendor, says the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, says the Lord of hosts. The latter splendor of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give prosperity, says the Lord of hosts." So if you didn't get that, that was coming from the Lord of hosts. So today we go from taking time with Jonah along his reluctant journey to Nineveh, and we find ourselves in a completely different time concerning Israel's history. It's much different than the experience of our friend and prophet Haggai. Haggai is considered a minor prophet, probably in part because the prophetic voice is limited to just 2 chapters. Yet hearing the powerful words of this prophet, we come to learn that powerful messages can be conveyed in just a few words. In fact, sometimes we hope for that. In one moment, we are in one reality, and in the next, we find ourselves in a separate one. After the Israelites have returned from exile, they are conquered yet again, ransacked, and the temple, God's house and center of God's power, has been destroyed in this process. Well, then the Persians came along and, they defeated the Babylonians. And the Persians, they said it was okay that you enslaved and the folks that have been taken from your homes, you guys can go home now. But you still have to be our puppet, and you have to give us ginormous amounts of money as a Persian state. But let's talk about the temple for a second. The temple was a very important piece of their culture. Israel was a theocracy, meaning that religion and politics were one and the same there. This temple was the religious center of their people. While they had other places to worship, this temple was special. Do you remember the stories of Abram and Sarai? They were called from their homes by the Lord. They gathered up their possessions, their family, their lives, and they went in search of a home. They looked and looked, and they went where God called them to go. They traveled through Egypt and many dangers on the road. They traveled in search of a home. Do you remember Moses? The people were enslaved, treated poorly, and the Egyptian king began to fear what was different and began a reign of genocide upon the Hebrew people. They fled that place in search of a home. They wandered the desert for 40 years, and when they came upon the home that they had been promised, somebody was there. These are just but 2 stories of a nomadic people who take so long before they find a place that they can call home. Then Egypt, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and Persia, they all take their home away from them again. I say this not to just recap a history of a people, but to remind us that they have been looking, they have been hoping, they have been yearning for a home. The temple and God's desire for the people to build it are a reflection of their desire for their own home. While we might be a little judgmental of placing God in a box physically and metaphorically, another way of looking at this is that it is a gift. The Israelites are able to share with God what they themselves have desired so desperately, a home in this temple. We will see that the temple system, just like any human-made system, is broken and eventually becomes corrupt. We see Jesus many years later strolling through the temple, flipping tables and whipping money changers. But for the purposes of the text this morning, let us put aside that and we will look at the temple as a place of hope and as a gift that they are able to give to God who has brought them home. The temple is the source of life within their community. Everybody, you got to travel to the temple because that's where you're able to make your sacrifices. You came for the special festivals, and you came to celebrate holidays. It is poetic that you are a people who have known so much wandering, and now you make a journey to the temple to be in God's dwelling place. It is a reminder that it is only when we go to God that we are able to find our true home. But that's another sermon for another time. Today, as we look at the prophet Haggai, we look at the story as a whole. The Persians have so graciously allowed the Israelites to return to Israel from exile. The wealthy and the elite, those were the ones that were taken, they make their way back. They travel back to their home only to find that so many things have changed. For generations, they have been gone. Land has been claimed by others. Houses have been torn down. And there has been a shift in culture as well. Those who are exiled to Babylon and those who are left behind in what was left of Israel are seen as two separate groups of people now. That farm that had been in your family for generations, that was Uncle Bob's, well, somebody else has moved in and somebody else is farming that land now. The people return to their home only to find that God's dwelling place, the temple, has been destroyed. Now, Haggai, as this prophet, they catch kind of a lucky break. While many prophets have to preach doom and gloom, Haggai gets to be kind of like the encourager. He's like the assistant coach. Persia, in their benevolence, has agreed to allow Israel to rebuild their temple. The work has begun to rebuild the temple, but the finished product continues to elude Israel. It reminds me of that hotel across the river over there, if you've lived here for at least 3 years. The land has been cleared off for as long as I can remember, but it seems like the hotel will never be finished. The people had returned and they had been given the okay for the construction of the temple by their overlords, but yet the temple remains in shambles, destroyed by the invaders many generations ago. This is where Haggai jumps up and he shares the God's vision for the rebuilding. Do you remember the temple in its glory? God's dwelling place? Does this place look like anything like it used to? Take comfort and know that God is with you. The house is nice, but even without it, I'm going to be among you. See, I am with you and we shall rebuild this temple. We shall rebuild our lives. The temple will remind us of where we come from. And as our people witness its construction being rebuilt from the destruction of war, so they shall see that in their own lives, a rebuilding and an uncovering of hope. As the temple has been a reflection of the Israelites' journey and search for a new home, the rebuilding of the temple is a reflection of their need and desire to rebuild their lives and community, to rebuild their families, to rebuild their nation. The Israelites have just come out of a really hard time. They've lost part of their identity. They're afraid. They're uncertain of their future. Perhaps they fear what they will build will never measure up to what once was. Israel's history is a long and dramatic tale that is emotionally exhausting. God's hope through this prophet Haggai is for a future that includes a rebuilding of life. In our text, God recognizes that it will not be the same, but that it will be well. The word translated as prosperous in the Hebrew is the word shalom. Many of us have heard this term before, but it doesn't really translate well in this text. Shalom means whole. It means well. It means in fullness. It means peaceful. It's a little bit bigger than prosperous. The word as translated in our text does not do justice for the hope that God has for the Israelites, and it's not about monetary prosperity. It's about the rebuilding of the temple just as it was. It's about creating a place for shalom, a place for sharing peace, for building up the people of Israel and returning them to the wholeness of God. Our lives are often cycles of wholeness and destruction and then rebuilding. You could even translate that as life, death, and resurrection. We are a people of the resurrection, after all. One of the things that I love about our texts is that I never know what others will hear. I never know what I'm going to hear half the time. Will you hear a call for hope and rebuilding in your own life? Some of us have had significant events in our lives that cause us to reevaluate. Births, deaths, changes in occupation, even simply a feeling or loss of direction. Some of us will hear this and immediately think about the election that we had this week. Every 4 years we make decisions about who is going to lead us. And as followers of Christ, our allegiance does not lie with a political campaign or, dare I say, even a nation. The shalom that God desires for us is an idea and hope for wholeness that is manifested on two levels. It is, of course, personal, but it is also systemic. I have seen movements for wholeness in this fragmented election. Moments for personal and interpersonal shalom. People have been reaching out, making peace with one another, knowing that we must live and work together to move forward. The making of wholeness invites us to partner, to build relationships and hold together. Instead of creating one side against the other, we find the commonality in our desire for wholeness. Now, God's desire for shalom also addresses systemic issues as well. We see clearly in our sacred texts a call to care for the most vulnerable within our cultures. That doesn't mean that we don't care about others, but there are systems in place that favor certain people over others. I have hit the jackpot as a white male living in the United States. There are others who, based on race, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, and other things that in our culture are for some reason less valued or cast judgment upon, are thrust on the margins of society. But the wholeness of God requires us as people of God to build up this peace within our lives and in our communities, in our interpersonal relationships, and to change the systems within our society which hold people back. God is encouraging us. God is calling us. God is petitioning us to build up the shalom in our lives, in our workplaces, in our places of worship, and everywhere else we might find ourselves. Let us receive with open ears and hearts God's call to share in this new wholeness and hopefulness. Amen.